Any discussion of student success in online learning is always centered around engagement. Students who engage often and deeply with the course materials, with each other, and with you are more successful. Students who do not engage as frequently or as deeply are less successful. A whole host of issues retention, mastery, persistence, timely completion, and postgraduate employment, to name a few are directly related to students' level of engagement in their coursework. One of the reasons we're talking about engagement in online courses is because students do not always engage to the levels that we as educators think they need to in order to achieve mastery. So, the critical question is, if they aren't engaging sufficiently, why aren't they engaging sufficiently? For this activity, I would like you to take 3 minutes or so to write down one thing, just one, that you have control over that acts as a barrier to student engagement. The barrier you identify has to be something that you as a faculty member can change. As you listen to this presentation, keep the barrier you identified in mind. See if it fits into the framework that we discuss. At the end of the presentation, I will ask you to share your barrier with your colleagues. Discuss your individual choice and why you selected it. Does it fit the framework? Can you, as a class, come to a consensus on the most important barrier to overcome, or identify the barrier that's easiest to address? So the three main barriers to creating better engagement that you as a faculty can directly affect. First, instructor readiness. We'll look at that through a TPACK framework, your own teaching habits and practices, and the design of your courses. We're going to take a look at TPACK first. TPACK, or Technical, Pedagogical, and Content Knowledge, is a framework or lens we use to examine instructor readiness to teach in an online or blended format. Teaching and learning online means working in a technology-mediated environment. By definition, there is a technical component to being successful. In most university settings, technical knowledge includes, at a minimum, understanding of the learning management system, in our case Moodle, office productivity software like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, multimedia creation and delivery tools, web conferencing software, and accessibility techniques. What we're talking about when we mention pedagogical knowledge in the TPACK framework is teaching approaches that are proven effective in virtual classrooms. These are things like active learning, frequent low-stakes assessment methodologies, creating and employing rubrics to guide student work, manage expectations, and provide effective feedback, creating and maintaining instructor presence, facilitating interactions via course discussions, office hours, and other workspaces. Mastering the unique pedagogy of teaching online is critical to being successful in an online and blended format. Your content knowledge, or expert level knowledge of what you teach, is often taken as a given, but it is not always a constant. I've been asked to teach outside my level of expertise on any number of occasions, and sometimes the pressure to help the department or your chair makes you say yes when you really aren't fully equipped. I've worked with instructors over the years who are learning the material a chapter or two ahead of their students, and in every single case, those courses were not well taught and the students did not achieve the same level of mastery as they would with an expert in the material. Having complete mastery of the technical, pedagogical, and content knowledge domains is critical to being successful as a teacher in an online and or blended format. What do I mean by teaching habits? In this context, I mean control, creating and maintaining instructor and social presence, and experience. Control is one of the key items here. The truth is you will not and cannot exert the same level of control over your students in the virtual classroom as you do in the brick and mortar classroom. More importantly, you shouldn't want to. If you want to foster autonomy, agency, and ownership, which are critical to success in online learning, you have to allow students to exercise those things. I've worked with many faculty who insist that students should not see the discussion posts of the other students until they create their own first post, or they were so concerned with cheating that they only opened quizzes for just long enough to complete them. The problem is, the more control you insist on, the less responsibility your students will take for their own learning. In online learning and blended learning, this means you will end up with a class of 20 people that do nothing more than sit looking at their screens waiting for you to tell them what to do. That's not engaging. If your students are using each other's discussion posts as models, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that peer learning? If you use quizzing properly as a tool for learning instead of as an assessment of learning, students will come to use those quizzes as a form of self-assessment. That's a positive. Take a deep breath. Let go. It will feel good. So, instructor presence. Learning is a social enterprise. If students are going to engage with you online, you have to let them. That seems like sort of a funny thing to say, but it's really important. In academia, there is a long tradition of seeking objectivity, using the third person language, for example, when we write or when we publish. When we discuss student actions, we say students will, not you will. In our face to face classes, we work to keep a certain amount of distance. The relationship between students and faculty is a business relationship, and keeping a certain amount of distance is important. The problem is the striving for objectivity and this creation of a distance becomes an issue in online learning where a distance already exists. Sometimes that distance is literally thousands of miles. The mission in online learning and blended learning is not to maintain that distance, but to shrink it. If you do not participate in online discussions, your students cannot discuss with you. It may seem silly to say that, but it's the truth. If you do not provide timely, meaningful feedback on assignments, feedback your students can apply to successive assignments and activities, then you are not present to them as an instructor. If you do not share who you are with your students, they do not see you as a human being. You lack social presence. If you lack social presence, your students will not engage. Finally, let's talk about experience. There is a saying, experience is the best teacher. But when you're trying something new, you do not have any experience. For many university instructors, teaching online and blended courses is all new. So you cannot bring the same level of expertise and experience to the virtual classroom as you do to the face-to-face classroom. In this context, when I talk about experience, I'm not talking about just your experience. Collectively, there is a huge body of knowledge on how to be successful teaching online and blended classes. One way to benefit from the collective experiences of researchers, experts in online teaching, and the thousands of faculty who have taught online is to employ best practices. These best practices are the collective knowledge of all those researchers, instructional designers, technologists, and university faculty the world over, distilled into a set of principles that you can use as a starting point for your blended and online teaching adventure. Course design is one of the areas that many of you are involved in. Even if you are not, being aware of what good online and blended courses look like or should look like can help you break down barriers to engagement. So let's talk about some of the more common design-based barriers to student engagement and how we can recognize if we are using them. Are you using a content-centered rather than learning-centered approach to your teaching? That's a barrier to student engagement. If you find yourself saying or thinking, I have to cover, instead of students need to learn, you are using a content-centered approach. Are you using an instructor-centered rather than student-centered teaching methodology? That's a barrier to student engagement. Do you find yourself thinking, this is how I teach, instead of this is how students learn best? If how you teach is not how they learn, they won't engage and they won't learn as much as they might. Employing an infrequent, high-stakes assessment model is a barrier to student engagement. If students are asked to take a midterm, final, and write a term paper, they have only 3 opportunities to engage meaningfully with the course content. High-stakes assessment models encourage shallow learning, cheating, and result in fragile, short-lived learning that does not transfer from one domain to another. A more engaging way of assessing students is a frequent, low-stakes assessment model that encourages engagement, discourages cheating and plagiarism, and leads to more durable learning, better student recall of critical information, as well as better transfer. Using a norm-referenced rather than criteria-referenced assessment model is a barrier to engagement and does not actually measure students' level of mastery. Ask yourself, do you really care if the engineer who designed the plane you'll be flying on next week got better grades than the girl sitting next to him in class? I know I don't. I want to know if that engineer can build a safe, reliable airplane. What I care about here is mastery. If you are assessing your students by comparing them to each other, then you are using norms rather than criteria to assess their work. Do you find yourself saying, I only give 2 A's a term? We're only allowed to give so many A's. Or, I generally curve my grades by. If what you want is mastery of learning objectives and durable, authentic learning, you use criteria. Students who achieve mastery based on criteria know what they need to know to succeed in the next class and in their careers. Using academic rather than authentic assessment activities is a barrier to engagement. In all 3 of my careers, as a photographer, as an instructional designer, and as a soldier, I never once went to work and took a test. Neither will your students, and they know it. Ask yourselves, Will your students be doing this when they are at work next week? If not, what real value does that activity have to them? Why should your students engage beyond a minimum necessary to pass the class if what they're learning has no value beyond the classroom door? So, here we are at the end of the presentation. How does what we've discussed compare to what you wrote down before we started? Please share your ideas and discuss the barriers to engagement in the discussion forum in Module 4. Thank you.